This is Marianne Moenraj interviewing Jo Walton. We're at World Fantasy in New Orleans 2022, and I'm really delighted that Jo had some time. She was one of the guests of honor at this convention, and that she was able to make a little time for us. So it would take quite a while to go through her entire bibliography. I want to say you have 15 or 16 novels?
15 novels, yeah.
Yes, and in the course of writing those novels and short stories and plays and poetry, Jo, and essays and so on, Jo has won multiple awards and been a finalist for a whole bunch more. So you've won the Hugo, you've won the Nebula, I know, and probably...
Yeah, World Fantasy Award.
Fantasy Award for, among others, right? So,
not for among others. Among others won the Hugo and the Nebula.
That won the Hugo
Tooth and Claw won the World Fantasy Award.
Tooth and Claw, right. So I think Tooth and Claw was actually, maybe we could start there. I know you had a trilogy before that, but Tooth and Claw was, I think, where I first encountered your work. And so it is... based on Anthony Trollope, if I'm remembering right. And it's sort of Victorian society, but with dragons. And
yeah, I describe it as a sentimental Victorian novel about dragons who eat each other.
Yes.
That's my capsule synopsis of that book.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I really loved about it is that it has both this sort of sentimentality and the softness of the, kind of the Victorian era, but also the brutality, right? And you give us both of those. So maybe we could start with you just talking a little bit about what drew you into writing that book and how it evolved. Because one of the things I'd like to talk about overall in this interview are how different your books are, and I think maybe if we can talk about kind of how you came to a couple of them, that might help illustrate.
So the professional wisdom about how to have a career in our genre is that you have a popular series and you keep writing in your world and your popular series and everybody wants the next volume. Mm-hmm. And that is one way to do it, and a lot of people have done that. But I would be very, very bored by doing that. A lot of people are very happy doing that, and that works for them and they love it. Mm-hmm. But it's not me, really. Mm-hmm. And I am interested in genre as a thing, and if you read my Tor.com posts where I write about books, I'm very often interested in where the edges of genre are and where subgenres emerge, and when you see them bubbling up and becoming a thing before all of their constraints get set as a form, and that's just a thing I find interesting. And so when I am writing something, when I've got an idea for something, I know the shape that genre will push it into. And I can think, okay, I'll do a thing that'll be in the shape of a particular subgenre. It'll go like that. And then the expectations will be this and that, and I will do that. So I'd written 3 books. It's basically one book and a prequel, but it is in 3 volumes because of publishing random constraints that existed 20 years ago and are completely different now, that are in the same world and are historical fantasy. They're Arthurian. And those were my first novels, and really I was learning a lot about how to write when I wrote those. I wouldn't necessarily do it the same now. There's a lot of things I'd do different if I did that. And this was, of course, right around the time that you were setting up Strange Horizons, and my first actual publication was a short story that Jed bought for Strange Horizons.
Really?
But
I didn't know that.
After I'd sold the novel, but before the book actually came out. So that's always a plus, and I always mention that. So I'd written those, and I was going to sensibly write another novel in that world, but I was going to write it like 1,000 years later in that world, 1,200 years later. And it was going to be, so they were sort of Arthurian, they were 6th century equivalent, and I was going to write about the equivalent of the Highland clearances in that world, and I was doing some research for that, and I was going to write that, and I pretty much sold this But then I was moving to Canada, and 9/11 had happened.
Right.
9/11
You're from Wales.
From Wales, yeah. 9/11 happened. I was moving to Canada. There were a lot of big world things and life things. And I kind of went off the boil with that book, and I was also tired of that world. I felt like I'd really explored the metaphysics and the magic system that I used in those books, and there was nothing exciting to do, and the exciting things I wanted to do with that were very hard. And so I was kind of a bit stuck.
Right.
And my leg was bad, and there was various stuff. So I was at home in our apartment in Montreal, and my husband Emmett went to work in the morning, and I was reading Trollope. I was lying in bed reading Anthony Trollope, as you do.
Of course.
Not for anything. In fact,
just
the reason I was reading it was Delia Sherman had talked about how Trollope has characters from one novel comment on another novel. And I wanted to see this in action, which meant that I needed to read multiple Trollope novels to actually get to see it in action. And it's very cool.
Yeah.
And I like how he does it. So anyway, I was reading Trollope. And then, this was a long time ago, this was 2002, the library rang to say that a book that I'd ordered was in. And the book that I'd ordered was Ursula Le Guin's The Other Wind.
Right. Book 5?
Yeah, I think it was The Other Wind. It was one of the later Earthsea books anyway, and it had come into the library. So I dragged myself out of bed, and I dragged myself off to the library, and I grabbed this book, and I dragged myself home again, and I got back into bed and started reading it, as you do. And then Emmett came home from work. And so he left, there's me lying in bed reading. He comes home, there's me lying in bed reading. And he says, because he knows I hate it if he says, how are you, how's your pain, I hate that, and he has learned this. So instead he said, how's your book? And I said, well, it's really good, but it doesn't understand dragons. And he said, Anthony Trollope doesn't understand dragons. And I suddenly had this revelation that Anthony Trollope understands dragons really well. What he's got problems with is human beings. Because Trollope genuinely appears to believe that women are like Lawrence ducklings, and they fixate on the first man they fall in love with, and they can never fall in love with anybody else ever again, because once they fall in love, they get set on that track, and they can't see anybody else. That's the right thing, and he really seems to believe this. And I sort of lay there, and I just did the whole world build for Tooth and Claw in about 10 minutes, just sitting there. Out of the thought that Trollope doesn't understand dragons, yes, he does. Just out of my idle remark that I didn't like the way that Le Guin was dealing with dragons in the late Earthsea, the Earthsea revision book. And I just thought I could do this with dragons, and it would be biological imperatives that made the women like that. And I could do this, and I started thinking about this and thinking through the world, and I thought, and I can do all this interesting stuff about slavery and Victorian brutality.
Right.
And there's a chapter in Tooth and Claw called The Perils of Consumption, in which some baby dragons get eaten by some big dragons. They're consumed. Because I just read a Trollope book in which somebody had 6 children, and then in the next book she only had 3 because they died between volumes.
Sure.
And, I mean, it was disease.
Right.
It was disease, but it really was exactly the same as if a dragon had swooped down and eaten them. You know, you could do that. And I thought, OK, I'm going to do this. And I got out of bed, and we ate dinner, and I went to the computer, and I wrote, actually, the first 3 chapters of Tooth and Claw before I went to bed. And I had the whole thing in my head. And I did nothing for months but write the book and read more Trollope. And the more Trollope I read, the more things I thought I wanted to put in it about work. Trollope writes really well about work, about ordinary work. And he did ordinary work. Right. He worked for the post office. He, in fact, invented the system of having mailboxes that you could go to and put mail in that didn't belong to you, that anybody could put mail in, and then they all got collected from the same thing.
Oh, okay.
Instead of having a mailbox in front of every house, like
Right.
many US suburbs still have. He came up with that. But anyway, he had a normal job that he did every afternoon, and he kind of wrote. He had to be in the office at 11, and he wrote before that. He wrote really well about work, and I sort of saw all these things that he was doing really well, and all of these things he was doing in this really bizarre way. And I just made it be about dragons, and I had a contract to write a completely different book.
Right.
But I think I sent like the first half of it to Patrick Nielsen Hayden, my editor at Tor, then and now. And he didn't say anything. He didn't reply, and I kept on writing it. And then after a while, I emailed him and I said, I don't expect you've had a chance to look at that thing I sent you, Tooth and Claw. It's a little bit weird. And he said, oh, yeah, it's great. It's both charming and creepy. Keep going with it. And so I finished the book, and they put a great cover on it. The original hardback cover was really good. I love that cover. I love the cover it's got now as well. But they put this great cover on it. And then, to my complete surprise, it was nominated for and then won the World Fantasy Award. And that was the first major award. I'd won what was then the Campbell, the Astounding Award for New Writer, but I hadn't been nominated for anything else up to that point. And so it was a complete surprise. And I went to the World Fantasy in Taipei, and I won. And it was, it was amazing. And that did my career a lot of good, because I had done this thing where I'd written a completely different book that was completely off the wall and not what people would expect my next book to be.
Right.
But it was very successful. And it's also a book that, when I went to the WorldCon in 2004 in Boston, people kept telling me they loved it. And I had this experience where I went to the small beer table to buy a Theodora Goss chapbook that had just come out then. And Kelly Link was there, and she was raving at me about Tooth and Claw. I was like, Kelly Link likes my book. Oh, this is amazing.
Exciting, yeah.
Jane Yolen liked my book. And so I got a lot of sort of critical appreciation, or not critical, but appreciation of it, and that was really great. But by the time it won the World Fantasy Award, I had already written my next book, which was Farthing. And Farthing is a very, very political alternate history book set in a world where, after the fall of France, Britain makes peace with Hitler. And the US never comes into World War II, because the US didn't come into World War II until December the 6th of 1941. And if Britain had made peace in May, then if Pearl Harbor happened, it would have meant a war in the Pacific, but not a European war. And it's set in 1949, and it is a cozy mystery. And what I was saying before about genre, cozy mystery is a genre that I've read a lot of, and I know how they work. So writing an alternate history cozy mystery was a thing that I could figure out how to do. I could see my way how to do that. This was 2004, the Iraq invasion, and Abu Ghraib and all of this was going on, and I was very angry about it, and I'd voted for Tony Blair, and so I felt it was a betrayal.
Sure.
That Tony Blair has admitted lying to Parliament. It was just all lies. And aggressively invading a country based on nothing. And I was very, very angry about that. And I was very angry at the sort of smug way that people talk about World War II and us as the good guys.
Yeah.
As if it was inevitable. And as if people who are alive now get the credit for it, when in fact it was my grandparents. You know, my father was born in 1944. I was born in 1964. This isn't my generation, never mind young people getting the credit for World War II. And I wanted to do a thing of, it didn't have to happen like that. It could have happened in this horrible way instead.
Right.
And I wasn't the first person to do that, though I think I was the first person to do a compromise rather than Hitler winning. But other people have done it since. It's not a terribly original thing to do. But I wrote this, and it's a chilling mystery novel.
It is. I mean, the tone of it is so different from Tooth and Claw. Right?
Yes.
Tooth and Claw, even with all the eating of dragons, there's a lot of humor to that book. I thought it was quite funny.
Yes.
It's funny. And then when I picked up Farthing, and I was like, this is not more of the same. This is a completely different tone.
Yep. Completely different. Could not be more completely different, really. You know, there are things that I am always interested in and that are in all of my books, but there are also, it is very interesting to be doing different things. So I wrote Farthing very fast, and then I wrote the other two more slowly, and I did a lot of research post-Farthing.
This is Halfpenny and...
Yeah, Halfpenny and Half a Crown.
And Half a Crown, right.
And I thought I was doing post-book research because I'd written Farthing so fast, and then I had the idea for doing the other two. And I did those. I did a lot of research and a lot of work on those.
When you say research, could I pause you and just ask you to talk a little bit about sort of what, like, for those books, what was your process for doing research? Were you reading fiction or non-fiction? Were you reading historical accounts? Like what?
So before I wrote Farthing, this was not research. I was just reading. Okay, I had probably read 60 or 100 cozy mysteries, just because I wanted to. Okay. Just not as research, not for anything. Just reading them over years.
Right.
I'd read tons and tons of them. And then, while I was reading Farthing, I deliberately read the collected essays, letters and journalism of George Orwell, which is 4 volumes, and I was reading those the whole time I was writing the book. But the book did not take me long to write. And then afterwards, I'd already read quite a lot about the 1930s and World War II, and both fiction and non-fiction, before I wrote the book. But then afterwards, I deliberately set out to read a lot of specific history, particularly of other countries, that I had missed out on. I read William Shearer's Fall of the Fourth Republic, about France between 1871 and 1945, and everything that went wrong that led to what happened in France, and also about fascist France. And I read tons about Germany and Eastern Europe, and I read, you wouldn't believe how much I read about fascist Spain. Not the Spanish Civil War, which I already knew quite a lot about, but actually fascist Spain and how fascist Spain worked and how it was, and about the end of fascism in Spain and Portugal.
Right.
So I did a lot of straight-up reading history, but I also read deliberately, and for the purpose of the book, I read a lot of fiction written in the period. I read a lot of fiction written in the 30s and during the first half of World War II. Because you get the little details in the fiction, particularly romance novels. If you read romance novels are aspirational. And so they're sort of, in a way, they're saying to women, this is what you ought to want. You work in a shop, you want the Duke's son to come in and buy a hat from you and realise you're wonderful and marry you and sweep you away. But when the Duke's son asks you to go and have a drink, where does he ask you to go and have a drink? What do you wear? It's imagination, it's aspiration, it is fantasy, but it can't be too far from reality or it breaks for people. The girl who works in the shop can't put on her fur coat. She's got to envy other people's fur coats.
Right.
And put on her own thin wool coat. But her thin wool coat is probably better, the one in the book, is probably better than the real reader's wool coat. Either better or worse, depending on what the writer's trying to do.
Right.
But the details of what people eat, both the fancy meal that the Duke buys and what she eats when she goes home to her mother's house, are there. You know, the thing you're supposed to want, the thing you really have. It's all there on the page in the way that a social history just won't give you the same kinds of details of what you're supposed to be dreaming about and what you're supposed to really have.
That's fascinating. It would not have occurred to me.
And so I've done that a lot. And there are some absolutely heartbreaking romance novels written in 1940 and 1939. Because, of course, the writers didn't know the way the war was going to go, and we do. So they're writing into a blank future that we can fill in. And sometimes I'd be reading these books, and people would be, in 1939, they'd be walking along in London looking in shop windows, and I'd be saying to them, go buy a coat. You're going to need a coat. There's going to be rationing. Buy a coat, girl. Raisins, stock up on dried fruit because you're sure not going to have any. And that's an interesting experience as well, you know. But I also enjoyed reading these things. And most of the research stuff that I read, the non-fiction I enjoyed reading. However, I read 6-volume, the stenographic records of Hitler's dinner conversations.
Oh my God.
They were recorded and then typed up. And these books exist, and they're on the library shelf, and anybody can go and read them, but nobody does.
Right.
I was the first person ever to take those out of the library, and I'm not surprised. Because that was no fun.
Right.
But it told me what Hitler wanted to do if he won, which I could then use to extrapolate the years that didn't happen because, thank goodness, they didn't happen. And also the system that he used for trying to run the places that he'd conquered and so on. So I just read all that, so you don't have to. And the best thing I found in reading those was Joseph Goebbels complaining that everybody he knew, so Nazis, right? Everybody he knew came to him and they said, oh, look, I think what you're doing about the Jews is great. I hate the Jews, but I've got this one Jewish friend who's not like the others, and could we make an exception for that family? And these people were Nazis.
Right.
And this actually gives me faith in human nature.
Yeah.
Because even the actual Nazis who actually hated the Jews and actually were doing this terrible, terrible stuff, they all had their Jewish friend.
Right.
And Goebbels was complaining they all had their Jewish friend, but it gives me a sort of tiny little candle flame in very dark darkness.
Right.
That was true. Yeah. So I really immersed myself in all this awful fascism when I wrote those books, and then I was so done with it.
Yeah.
And when people say now, they're being reprinted in 1 volume next year in the Tor Original series, and they're going to have they're going to have an introduction by Brad DeLong, and it's going to be 1 volume of all 3 of them. And I kind of wish that what people would say about them is, they're very well written, and Jo handled the genre stuff, and the characters are great, but they're so passé, you know. Fascism is so irrelevant to the world. I don't know why anybody would write that. That's what I want to live to hear people saying that those books are not relevant to anything.
I think we're a little ways away from that.
I believe that we are a little ways away from that indeed, yeah. So I wrote those, and then I was kind of a bit burned out after writing those. But I was also, simultaneously and in between writing those, I was writing Life Load, and I kept writing Life Load in patches in between writing other things. It was a book I got stuck on a lot, and I can remember at one point thinking the farthing was like a sharp little needle, and Life Load was like a big, messy bag of knitting. And eventually I got Life Load into reasonable shape. And at this point, I was supposed to be writing something. I forget what I was supposed to be writing, but I wasn't writing it. I was messing with Life Load, and then I wrote on LiveJournal a description of the South Wales mining valleys that I grew up in. And it was largely in response to an American friend being really weirdly sentimental about Wales and the Celtic thing and like this. And I wanted to say, no, this is a real place. It's not a fantasy place. It's a real post-industrial place. And I wrote this sort of description of it. And it was quite long. It was quite long for a blog post. And loads of people said in comments, oh, this is great, you know, like people do. And some people were saying it ought to be a book. And I was in the kitchen and I was making dinner, and I thought, I don't understand how people can be so silly. Because there's no way that could be a book. It's just a description of a place that I grew up in. How could that possibly be a book? There's no kind of story there. There's nothing that you could make into anything. And then I got the idea for, among others, I thought if I kind of mythologized my life and I could see how to do it, then I could sort of write that book. And then I sort of started writing it, and I thought, are you allowed to do this? Are you allowed to talk about people reading real books that are in print and that are not classic books? Because in Pamela Dean's Tam Lin, all of the books that the characters read are things that are classics.
Sure.
And you can talk about them. And I couldn't think about anything that I'd read that talked about people reading, you know, Delaney.
Yeah, maybe not Delaney. I think I loved Among Others. It was a lovely, lovely read. And I think it reminds me a little bit of, I think it's 14 Charing Cross Road.
87.
87. I don't know.
Yes.
I got the number completely wrong. Charing Cross
87
Road.
Charing Cross Road, Helene Hanff.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the letters that they sent back and forth during the war, and the text. I often was not familiar with the text that they were referencing, but it didn't matter.
Yeah.
They loved them, they knew them, and they spoke about them.
I love that book. And it's non-fiction.
Yeah.
And most of what they're writing about, again, is classics, is older things. And I couldn't think about anything that was writing about contemporary or relatively contemporary books that were in print.
Right.
And I'm like, is this fair use? If I have people in the book talking about Samuel Delaney and Ursula Le Guin and criticising their work, if I have a character saying she doesn't like Philip Dick, that's okay because he's dead. But if I do that, can you do that? Is that a thing that you're allowed to do?
Right.
And I was sending it to Patrick, and I asked him, and he just laughed at me.
Right.
And he said, yes, you can. He said, We'll put it past our legal people to make sure, but it's absolutely fine. You can do this. And I'm like, I'm using Lord of the Rings a lot, and I'm assuming that the reader will recognise references to Lord of the Rings. He said it's the most well-known book in the English language. You can totally reference it.
Right.
And I said, but you know, the Tolkien estate, I think. And he says, no, it'll all be fine. It'll all be fine. So I did that, and I thought that, among others, was a really weird book. And I thought that only 10% strange people would like it. I thought it would be a very, very niche book.
Well, you were wrong.
I was so wrong. I think I was 45 when, among others, came out, and I learned from that experience that I am less weird than I thought I was. because the response to Among Others, first among people that worked at Tor, and then in the wider fandom and the wider world, was people recognising themselves in the character. Mm-hmm. And they all universally love her, and they, even young people who haven't read any of those books, who had the similar experiences reading Harry Potter and reading things that were there when they were young that didn't exist in 1979, recognise the experience, even the people who don't recognise the books. And the most common review of Among Others on Goodreads, the naive reviews, is people saying, I loved this book, but I don't know if I can recommend it to anybody because the reasons I love it were so personal to me. And everybody says this, you know, everybody. It's amazing. And that was a very strange experience, but it made me realise that I'm less weird than I had always thought I was, and that less alone, because many people responded to that. Well, some people hated her, but the general response was overwhelmingly positive. And I did think, nobody liked me when I was 15. Nobody liked me. but they liked her because they're seeing her from the inside and they could get the commonality, whereas they were only seeing the spiky outside of me.
Well, you know, you're making me think about, I feel like a lot of young writers, new writers, whether they're young or not, new writers, when they set out, they try and create these universal characters. They lean heavily on these ideas they have of tropes of the hero or the romance heroine or whatever else, and it seems to me that you leaned into your, and this is maybe true through all of your books, you leaned into your particularity, your specific interests, the things that caught your attention, that you went deep into, and you wrote them, and what we see is that people love them, and people do find in this specific particularity, nonetheless, even if their specifics are slightly different, there is something there that they are responding to that speaks to their own experience. You know
that quote about the most important thing is sincerity. Once you can fake that, you've got it made.
Sure.
I think that it is true that readers can see when you mean it. Yeah. And when you care. Mm-hmm. And many people are trying very hard to do that faking sincerity thing. Yeah. And they're trying too hard. Mm-hmm. And the reader will see that it isn't sincere. Right. And I write about what I'm interested in. I write about what I care about. And when I wrote Tooth and Claw, I was caring a lot about Trollop and Victorian dragons. And when I wrote Farthing, I was caring a lot about how people resist fascism. Mm-hmm. And when I wrote Among Others, I was mythologizing my life. And there was one moment when I thought, when I finish this book, am I going to feel repelled by my own life as I kind of feel repelled by some of my research interests that I've really got into and then got tired of? Mm-hmm. Is that going to happen? And it kind of did in a way, in a very strange way.
I just finished. I just handed in a memoir about my cancer treatment, and I was very sick of my own voice by the third time through proofreading the thing. But
that was only a few years ago.
8 years ago. It was
that's probably enough time.
Yeah.
Because what I decided in the end was that there was a big difference between 15-year-old version of me that was in the book and the 45-year-old version of me that was writing the book. Right. And that gap was enough that I felt that it was okay and I could see myself with distance. Mm-hmm. And a little bit of humour and from outside and also inside. But I am always sympathetic to my characters, even my awful characters. And my characters are very solid to me. And I usually start with... I often start with the world, but the characters are very early because the world and the characters kind of come along together, because the characters are the people who could only live in that world, and the world has shaped the characters. So when I'm thinking about a world, when I'm thinking about the magic system, or I'm thinking about the politics or whatever, that world will change the people that are in it because of the way the world is. So I'm thinking about those people in that world, and they sort of come to me, and I think what people would hate this world, what people would love this world, who would it work for, who would it be bad for, and then I get all the characters sort of coming together. And sometimes before I start writing, and other times I'll be writing and new characters will come alive on the page when I've got people that they're just meant to be a function. The way I talk about this is the spear carrier. You've got somebody standing by the door holding a spear, and you might never even mention that they're there, or you might have them threaten with a spear, or you might have them become the best friend who helps the hero do his hair before the party. And you just meant them to be holding a spear, but their hairdressing skills come in really useful, because when you wanted to have half a line there, you said that the god had elaborate braids. And then later on, the god's elaborate braids can come in useful to do that. And or they'll develop a personality for whatever reason, or they won't, because every single spear carrier can't have a personality. There's not enough room in the page. So I'm thinking about characters very early on, and I genuinely care about my characters, and I think that
it comes across.
Sincerity is there, and I think that's what it is. And you talk about new writers trying to position themselves. I think that there is a thing... Many new writers or beginning writers are desperate to be published. They're desperate to be validated. I was desperate to be validated. I think it's natural and normal.
Right.
But people will try too hard because of that, and to get that validation. And they can lose what they're really writing for in that desire for validation. And that's very sad.
It's very tricky, right? I mean, Neil Gaiman, I think, has said that the one unique thing you have is you and your view, your perspective, your way of seeing things, and that's what you want to put on the page. And I agree with that. And at the same time, it's frightening, right? It's you know, every time you are sincere, and maybe it's a bit of dialogue in a love scene, maybe it's a political argument that you put on the page. I'm working with some things now where I'm sort of trying to write about political resistance movements, and I've been reading, John Lewis's March and work from Dr. King and Malcolm X, and I'm trying to parse like where I stand in all of this and what I want to represent. And eventually, if this gets finished and out into the world, people will read and they will judge, right? And there will be people who are going to be passionately angry at some of the things I might say, right? And there are going to be people who find my characters, unappealing or unlovable, and I'm like, they're all me, right? So we put these books out in the world, and there's a little part of it that's like saying, see me, love me, and it can be hard to...
You have to be brave. You really do have to be brave, and sometimes it's very hard to be brave, and it's much easier to do the easy thing, to write the hero's journey, to write the romance heroine who isn't you in any way.
Right.
Because then you've got a shield.
Right.
Between who you are and what you're doing. And again, with the political stuff, it's way easier not to go there, because if you do put yourself out there on that, you are putting yourself out there to be ripped to shreds.
Right.
And you will get it wrong. We all get it wrong.
Yeah.
And there's things that... there's things that people do that are perfectly reasonable things to do in the moment they do them, and then 10 years later when you look back at them you think, ugh, did I do that? And other people will call you on it, and they're right to call you on it.
Right. Yeah.
Even though, that's where we were 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Things change, and we know it will change, and we will be judged. And in some ways, it's good that we'll be judged, because that means the world will have got better.
Right. No, absolutely.
But it's still hard.
It's still hard.
And it still takes a level of being brave and sincere and putting yourself there. And I don't know if you've read Ada Palmer's Terra Ignota books, but what I'm going to say is the acknowledgements in those books are incredibly brave and open in a way that people normally write acknowledgements. I write acknowledgements just like everybody else does, and I'll thank people, and I'll maybe be a little bit funny. There's an acknowledgement in The Just City where I say, I read Plato much too young, for which I'd like to thank Mary Renault. Okay? But I'll do that kind of thing. But Ada's really putting herself in there in a very, very brave way.
So I read the books, but I don't remember. Maybe I didn't read the acknowledgements.
Well, no, maybe you didn't, because a lot of people don't. But she's really sort of making herself vulnerable and talking about disability and talking about friendship and doing this in a way that is not the accepted, slick, okay way, but is a very brave way that's made me rethink how I do this, and we're all putting ourselves out there in different ways when we write, and what we put on the page and how we put it on the page. And certainly it takes a certain amount of courage, and particularly to be open.
Dorothy Ellison, who wrote Bastard Out of Carolina, has this book. It's called Skin, talking about sex, class, and literature, and it's mostly a collection of essays, of speeches that she gave at various points. So there's some repetition in it and so on. But she has a bit where she's talking about how the best writing comes when you are terrified and you write through it anyway, right? And I think what she means by that is that readers can tell. They can tell that you're engaging honestly with this difficult material and putting it on the page. I had one piece I was working on once that I was having such a hard time with, and I was really grateful that my boyfriend was sitting across from me in the cafe, because I would write a scene and then I would have to get up, put my coat on, go out into the Salt Lake City winter, walk around the park, compose myself, come back, write the next scene, and then do it again. So it was great that he was there and could watch the computer, because it was just sort of material that was difficult.
It really can be just like that. And I know there was one moment when I was writing My Real Children where I was at the computer, and my husband was in bed reading, and I got up and went into the bedroom, and I had tears streaming down my face, and he said, "Do you want a hug?" And I said, "Sure, I would like a hug, but what I need to know is what noise a Mac makes when it starts up." Because I was in a scene where I needed to know that, and I hadn't even noticed that I was that upset about my character going into a nursing home and not being able to take a computer and not being able to take a computer friends, which was just a very sad bit of the book. And it's moving, and we are moved by it, and we feel this when we're doing it. It's a strange vulnerability, really, and I think that you need to be sincere in a way that matters, and that matters to you when you're doing it.
Yeah, it's even if I'm reading someone where I'm not sure I agree with their conclusions, I'm thinking. I was recently recommending, and I'm going to forget their name, an anarchist, Margaret Killjoy, The Lion Shall Lie Down with the Lamb. I was recently recommending this book to my students, and I'm not at all sure that I agree with the politics of it, but Killjoy makes the arguments with total sincerity with very heartfelt characters in difficult situations, doesn't pull punches, doesn't give you a sort of an easy answer as to why, they're sort of asking the question of what happens when, you're in a society that is committed to not having police and then there's violence. How do you navigate that, right? And it's a difficult question, and I just really respected it. I got to the end of the book and it was like, this is someone who I really respect their intellectual engagement with this hard topic, right?
But it's not just hard topics, because sometimes people will get the wrong lesson from this idea, and they'll think, oh, I'll put a rape in my book. That's a hard topic.
Right.
And no, that's not what I'm talking about.
Right, right.
And it's not a case of being gritty. It's a case of being real.
Yeah.
And really engaged.
So, you have had very difficult material. I'm thinking of, The Just City. Maybe if you could just talk a little bit about what brought you to working on that set of trilogy, right? 3 books. Yes,
it's a trilogy. So that was actually the first idea I ever had when I was 15 and I was reading The Republic. Mm-hmm. I wanted to write a story about time travelers setting up Plato's Republic and taking 10-year-olds there, and I wanted to write it. This would have been 1980, 1981. Mm-hmm. I wanted to write it like a dystopia of the kind that you might get, like Native Tongue or something like that, okay? Mm-hmm. Like Shore of Women. I wanted to write it as a 1970s feminist dystopia, Plato's Republic.
Right.
And I was 15, and I actually did write it. Mm-hmm. And it was the first sort of longish thing. I think it was like just barely over 40,000 words. And it was as terrible as you would expect. And then I kind of forgot about it and didn't really think about that again for a long, long time. And then in 2011, I saw Bernini's statue, Apollo and Daphne, in Rome, in the Borghese Museum in Rome. And he has 3 truly great statues in that museum. There's that one, and there's Hades and Proserpina, and there's Aeneas and Anchises, which is not relevant to this argument, but is also great. But those 2 are both about rape. And it made me realise that all the visual art that we have about rape is about the male gaze. And you look at these pictures of loves of the gods, rapes of Zeus, right? And they are all, wouldn't you like to do her, or him in the case of Ganymede, right?
Right.
So they are all from the point of view of the violent male person, and they are showing you the vulnerable female body spread out for your delectation, you the rapist.
Right.
Whereas Bernini's statues were engaged in the conversation about consent that was saying something that we could jolly well do with listening to now. And they were saying, this is terrible, that the Hades and Proserpina, his fingers are going into her thigh and there are dents in the marble. And her face, there's one tear in her face, and you can't see, you can totally see her, and she's totally naked, but none of it is sexy in any way. It's all terrible, and you see it, and he is so terrible and brutal, and she is being carried off, and it's a very, very powerful piece. And then the Apollo and Daphne is in the process of turning into a tree. And the statue has time in it. And Apollo has got this beautiful, beautiful, invulnerable face. And he is embracing her. And she's about to turn into a tree. And the way that it is set up, he is about to be, if the statue were to keep moving, in 2 seconds, he would be thwacked in the groin by a tree branch. So this is about to happen in the statue. And I saw it. And it's amazingly beautiful, and it's an incredible technical piece that it's got these leaves and this woman becoming a tree and the beautiful god, and it's all made out of one piece of marble and the leaves, and it's amazing. So I was looking at it for a long time because it's amazing. And also because it was in the conversation in a really interesting way. And I kept thinking, what is going to happen when he gets hit by the branch, right? What's his face going to look like in 2 seconds' time? When he realises, is he capable of learning from this experience? He's not the brute that Hades is. He's got this beautiful god face. What is it going to look like? How is he going to cope with the fact that she's now a tree? And historically, mythically, he uses the leaves of the laurel tree to make a wreath, and it's the laurel crown that poets are crowned with.
Right.
So that's the response that he has to her turning into a tree. What does that mean?
Yeah.
And so I was thinking about that as I walked around this statue in Rome. And then a few months later, I'd got the Kindle. And there's all this Plato on Project Gutenberg that, like, isn't in Penguin Classics and wasn't available when I was a 15-year-old reading all of Plato that was in Penguin Classics. So I was reading it just for fun. And so I was rereading the Crito on the bus. And the bus got to where I was going, and I got off the bus. And I thought, if I was Crito, I would have hit Socrates on the head and let him argue later. And have taken him away from the people who were going to execute him. And I would have let him continue arguing somewhere else later. I would not have just sat there and let him argue himself into being judicially murdered.
Right.
And so I was walking along thinking this. And I thought, but you couldn't really, how could you have got him out, and what would it would take a miracle, really, to sort of do that. But I guess Crito could have bribed people, and I don't know, and then I sort of thought, well, what if he had divine help? And then I thought, well, where would he take him? Because he says he'd take him to Thessaly, which is the series name that I used then. And I thought, you remember that idea I had a million years ago about time travelers and Plato's Republic? What if I put the Greek gods in that? What if I put Apollo in that? What if it was Apollo 2 minutes after he got thwacked in the groin with the tree branch? And what if the whole book is about consent? Because the children who are taken to Plato's Republic, 10-year-olds, that Plato says we should start with, haven't consented.
Right.
Apollo was trying to rape Daphne without understanding what it meant. What if he learns what it meant? And what if I sort of went into that? And then I started getting the voice in my head. There are 3 first-person points of view in the book. But I started getting the snarky Apollo voice in my head, and I just wanted to write it. And I was in the middle of writing My Real Children, and I was like, nope, can't start that book until I finish this book. This will be bad, this will be bad. So I finished My Real Children, and I started writing The Just City the next day. And I wrote the first chapter. I wrote more than that. I wrote maybe a third of the book. And I was guest of honour at WisCon. And I took the unfinished, I never do this, I took the unfinished book on my computer to WisCon. And I had to do a 75-minute guest of honour reading, which is a long time, WisCon. Have you ever thought of this? So I read the first chapter of My Real Children, and that went down okay. And I took some questions, and I read some poetry. And then I said, OK, I'm going to read the first chapter of my work in progress that I'm in the middle of. And I thought, if this goes down OK at WisCon, it's going to be OK. And so I read the first chapter of my funny book about rape to a WisCon feminist audience, and it was a packed room, and they were rolling in the aisles.
Really? Okay.
They were really laughing. And that really made me feel that what I was doing was okay. And it's a very feminist book, really, and it's not a rapey book, but it is a book about consent issues in exactly the same way that Bernini's statues are not rapey statues, but they are totally about rape and consent issues. So I just, that was the theme, really, of The Just City. And the whole series then, I was doing some other stuff, and it's got the robots, and I had a lot of fun with the Socraticness. And I thought, what if you had people who come from a society that is axiomatically Platonic, in the same way that much of Western society is axiomatically Christian. Mm-hmm. And I've got friends who are Hindu and Muslim and Jewish, all of whom find the way that secular Western society is axiomatically Christian kind of jarring. Mm-hmm. And I thought, what if I had a society that was axiomatically Platonic, and they came across that and that just sort of didn't have any of this input, and they did this. So in future generations, so that the later books in the series are generations ahead. It's an old-fashioned generation saga where the main character of the second book is the daughter of the main characters of the first book, and the main character of the third book are the two more generations ahead. And I just thought that would be a very interesting thing to do. And what I wanted to do was to bring them back to connection with the future world, but I couldn't actually make that work, so that's about to happen at the end of the book, and I couldn't do it. It would be a better book if I could have, but I couldn't. It just wasn't, I couldn't get the level of reality right to do that. But if you have people who think that money is a curious idea, if you have people who assume that becoming the best self you possibly can is what everybody wants, in the way that we assume that finding your one true love is the thing that everybody wants. And they think, yeah, people find people to love, that's a perfectly normal thing to do, but becoming your best self, that's what you really want.
Right.
And so that was kind of interesting and also difficult.
It's interesting listening to you talk. You're reminding me a little bit of Ted Chiang, in that. So Ted, who mostly writes short stories, I've heard him talk about how his work is very idea driven, right? So he'll have a concept, he'll think it out, he'll do research if he needs to, he'll sort of plot out all of that and essentially write all of that. And then he goes back and puts in the characterization and the humanity that makes you invested. And I don't know how he does that. I mean, the story of your life makes me cry every time.
Yeah, me too.
It doesn't seem like something that you could write in that way, but clearly it works for him. But listening to you, it sounds a little similar in that you're clearly so engaged with these intellectual ideas and concepts, and what if you looked at it this way, and then it seems like that is then leading to you defining what kind of characters are going to emerge out of that environment.
But the characters come out of the environment. So one of the point of view characters in Necessity, the third book, I thought, I want to have a character who is not a gold in Plato's Republic, who is a silver, because that'll be an interesting thing to do. And I was thinking, okay, who would they be? And then I immediately got this idea of Jason, who says, when somebody's talking about hypostases, he says, I don't need all this stuff about hypostases, I'm just a fisherman. Plato's allegory of the cave is good enough for me. and that sentence kind of defines who he is.
Right.
And the world that he comes from as well. That's the topic sentence in a lot of ways. And just having that work. But thinking about what would somebody be like if they came from this society? And then I'll get that, and then they'll become real, and they'll develop more than just being a person from that society. So the best point of view character in Necessity, the one that I love the most, is Crocus, who is a robot. And I loved writing his point of view. I loved all of the chapters that are from his point of view. They were such fun. Because he developed as the books developed, and I just knew who he was, and I just loved being in his. Well, he doesn't have a head, but
right.
but writing his point of view is just fun. But I think I have the ideas, I have the world ideas, and then very shortly afterwards I have the characters, and then the characters help me develop the world.
Yeah.
And sometimes I'll have a character first. I'll have somebody in my head who's sort of like ridiculously honourable. And I think, okay, what world did they come from that has these incredible ideas of being ridiculously honourable like that? How did they get to be like that? And I'll retrofit the world to the character, but often it'll be the other way around, and particularly with minor characters, because they'll be the people that the world made them more so. But I do think about both things together. What I don't think about early on and in that way is plot.
Yeah, no.
Plot does itself. If you've got characters in a world, plot will come along.
Right. They'll want things, and things will be in their way, and then you just go from there. Yeah, no, I agree. I think I don't think I've really thought about my characters as being defined by their environment so much. But it makes a lot of sense to me. It's resonant, and the way it does play out, it's, sometimes I think about, okay, my parents decided to come to the U.S. when I was 2. They easily could not have. Right. They could have easily stayed in Sri Lanka, lived through the war. I would have had a completely different life, and it's you don't know how much are you still yourself, right? Like, what kind of person would I be growing up in that environment? Different influences, different. I still would have read. I would have been coming out of a literary household, but access to different books, etc. Right? Like, it would have completely reshaped me, and I think that's. People sometimes have some trouble with that as a concept, right? Like, because you want to think of yourself as like, well, I'm me, but.
So there would also be the possibility from Sri Lanka, okay, that the third possibility, that when you were 2, your parents could have decided to go to the UK. Because there's, a big community in the UK, they could have decided to go there. And then you'd have grown up with English books, but a very different society from what you had in California.
Or Connecticut. I grew up in Connecticut. Well, and in fact, like, there was very little. Like, I didn't encounter much racism against South Asians, and in the UK, I probably would have.
You would, right? And indeed, it would have been different again if you'd gone to California,
right,
where there's a big Desi community, and that would have been a different community.
Right.
And if you think about that, and you start thinking about maybe there's 4 versions that are all Marianne Mohanraj. And they've all got the things that are truly essentially you, but the environmental things that shape them would be different.
Right.
And one of them is you, and your 3 shadow selves would be different people because different things had happened to them. And maybe the one that grew up in the UK would be spikier.
Yeah, could easily.
Because she'd have had racism early, and she'd have had horrible British people who are horrible. Being bad, and maybe she would be, a harsher version of you, and maybe the one in Sri Lanka would be way more plugged into. I mean, even more than you are plugged into family.
Yeah,
there.
Sure, right.
And when you imagine those kinds of things, but it's still essentially the same essential person. That's just a very, very interesting thing to play with. And that's what I did in My Real Children with the 2 lives. But I wanted her to be the same person, so I didn't have her split until she was in her late 20s.
Yeah, that's a real interesting question. Like, at what point are you mostly formed, right? And and so she is changed by the different worlds that she lives in, and the choice that she made, and the way that it's shaping everything, and the different things that happen. But she's essentially the same person, whereas I think if you're a 2-year-old, who knows? I really think they would have been completely different people.
The normal way to do it would be to do it with, like, a 12-year-old.
Right.
And I think that there's still an amazing amount of malleability in a 12-year-old. and I wanted to do it so that she was the same person in two lives, which was what was interesting to me, more interesting to me about the idea than making it different people. But when twins are separated at birth and they find them again, they have a lot of the same mannerisms, and they also have things. The one thing that I was reading about said that if they've been brought up in religious households, they'll have the same degree of religiosity as each other, but it might be a completely different religion.
That's fascinating. That's
and
really
so when they'll both be skeptics or they'll both be observant, but it might be in completely different things. Or if one of those who brought up a militant Christian and the other who brought up a militant atheist, they still might both be skeptics, because that seems to be like inherent, and there's a lot of things that are inherent.
There are things that are inherent, and I know you have a son.
And, exactly.
Right, like, so, you
kids
know, I
come preloaded with a lot.
They do come preloaded.
Yeah.
I mean, my kids currently are 13 and 15, and you can see some things where we were able to influence them and that have shaped them, but there was quite a lot that is just fixed from the beginning, which is so...
Yeah, what I sometimes say about my son when I'm talking about this kind of thing is I raised him from a pup. So there's things that are certainly my taste that affect things, and that I brought him up a certain way, yes, but an awful lot of it is just who he is and how he inherently is.
And also the ways like that our brains work, right?
Yep.
So if you know, I have ADD, and so does my son, certainly, and possibly my daughter, and just the ways that we encounter the world.
So yourself, who grew up in Sri Lanka, would also have ADD. There's no question.
Yep. No, and it's interesting. My father, you know, when my son was diagnosed, and I was talking to him about it, my father had this moment, and he was a doctor in his 60s or so, or 70s, when we were talking about this, and he was like, you know, I think maybe I had ADD as a boy. I was always the kid, he would say, I was always the kid on the school bus who was jumping around, getting into trouble, and because I think his father was one of the wealthier men in the village, the bus driver was afraid to beat him, and so he got away with stuff, but he was getting scolded all the time. And it just and he had trouble, you know, he became a doctor eventually, but he had difficulty concentrating to memorize things. He had to take a couple stabs at it coming along, and so now it's fascinating seeing him looking back with this new framework to interpret his brain and his life through you know, what we know in this moment, which we may have a completely different conception in 20 years too. So I think I feel like we're at the beginnings, at the very beginnings of understanding all of this. So anyway, that was a little bit of a tangent, but it's
very interesting though.
Yeah, it's interesting kind of just thinking about, you know, that, like, how much has that been like running through my family for generations, right? So and then there's all the cultural stuff. You know, my family's all doctors and teachers, like going all the way back. And it's like, you know, how much of that is intellectual curiosity, having books in the house, and that getting passed down in a nurture kind of way, and how much of it is nature? And I don't know the answer, right?
Yeah, no, we really don't know the answer, and it is a thing that science fictionally we can explore. And that's fascinating to think about.
Well, I've kept you quite a long time, and we have...
yes, you're going to have to edit this way the heck down.
No. We're going to... I have to let you go shortly because of we're going on to the awards banquet, etc. So maybe if we could just finish. I've read most of your books, but not the last couple. So I've got a little behind the last few years on my reading. With the pandemic, I ended up watching many, many, many hours of British murder mysteries, and I'm only now coming back to reading. So I know you had a book that came out in 2020, so maybe just if you could talk a little about that. So
yes, I had a book that came out in July 2020, and it's sunk like a stone, because who in July 2020 wanted to read a book?
That's right. So let's lift it up and...
It's called Or What You Will, and it just came out in France, and I've just been in France doing a book tour with Ada Palmer, who also just had a book come out in France, so we just had a great time promoting it.
Sounds fabulous.
French people love it. It's wonderful. The book is called Or What You Will, and it's it's about creativity. And it is from the point of view of an imaginary friend who lives in the head of an aging woman writer. And she's a fantasy writer, and he has been her protagonist in a lot of her slightly schlocky fantasy novels. And he is afraid that she's dying, and he's worried about what's going to happen to him when she dies because he lives in her head. And I do this Greg Egan trick that Greg Egan does in Permutation City of putting you in the point of view of a copy so you never question whether they're real. And he is telling the story and he is directly addressing you, the reader. So you never doubt his reality. And so he is trying to tell the story of her life so that he can save her. From his point of view, her life as he has seen it, as her imaginary friend inside her head. And
just a little recursive, but go on, go on.
He is trying to also, both of them kind of separately and antagonistically, are trying to write a fantasy novel that is a sequel to fantasy novels that she wrote years ago, which are based on The Tempest and Twelfth Night. Because I want them to feel to the reader as if they're a sequel to something you've already read, right?
Right. Okay.
In which world, at the climax of the original trilogy, they defeated death, so nobody's died since. And she wrote these books in the 1980s, and it's been 400 years in the books, and nobody's died except by human will. So there is this fantasy world, there's the real world, there's him trying to tell the story of her past. They are in Florence. The fantasy world is a fantasy world version of Florence. It's kind of Shakespearean Italy. And it's also the beautiful background of Renaissance paintings with beautiful places you wish you could walk into. It's that.
Nice.
You can get there by walking into a painting, except that you can't anymore. But and so it's got a bunch of things going on with that, and there's a lot of discussion of creativity and all of this, and he is trying to get both of them into the fantasy world. And it sounds completely bizarre when I describe it.
It sounds like a delightful book for writers.
But it is what it is, and people are loving it in France, which is wonderful. The French cover is incredible. I love the French cover. I can show you. You can link to it.
We will link.
The French cover with the half a frame and the painting that's sort of old at one side and sort of new at the other, and it's Florence. That's
wonderful.
I really, really like it. So it's doing very well in France. But I keep meeting fans of mine who are like, "Oh, do you have another book out? I didn't know you had another book out." Now it's been out for 2 years.
Well, there was a pandemic.
There very much was, and I read a lot of romance novels set in Italy, and a lot of K.J. Parker, which I'd never read before, and I was very glad that it was all there for me to have an infinite number of novels about sieges in fantasy worlds. That's what I wanted.
Yes.
And that's fine. It was there, and you get through as best you can get through. And I'm not at all surprised people didn't read it.
Well, I like I said, I for some reason I think I got quite depressed during the pandemic. Didn't realize I was really, and I think my way of coping was watching all these British murder mysteries with people whose lives were much worse than mine, and somehow that made me feel better.
Good.
So
Good. Whatever makes you feel better.
Yeah, that's right, and they're wonderfully done, these miniseries, and I'd like us to see. The characterization is deep, and so an American TV could learn a lot from them, I think. I never say a word against comfort reading, because when people want to be comforted, they want to be comforted. Yeah. I hate it when people call things guilty pleasures. Yeah. Why are you trying to make me feel guilty? I don't feel guilty. Right. Don't feel guilty. Enjoy it.
Yeah, I've got a new thing to say, actually, when people ask me about guilty pleasures. I'm going to say G.K. Chesterton's Lepanto. because it's a very, very beautiful poem, but it is totally racist.
Oh,
so
no.
I feel guilty when I read it,
right?
Because it's got this gorgeous imagery and these wonderful rhymes, and and it's lovely, but it is also actually racist. So I quite correctly feel guilt when I enjoy it.
That's interesting.
Whereas I don't feel guilty for reading romance novels set in Italy that are utterly harmless.
That's right.
That in 100 years' time will be very, very useful for people wanting to recreate this era.
That's lovely. That's it. Now I'm like, what would be a guilty pleasure for me? I think there's a way in which there was a kind of British literature that I grew up with that was sort of, I mean, I'm thinking of Enid Blyton, really, more than anything else, like, that I adored when I was young, and very escapist, and I had these fantasies about ginger beer on the moors and so on. Yeah. And, you know, it's not that there's anything terrible about those books, but they did not really engage with the politics or anything real, right? So it was this kind of like, in the fantasy, I was a white British child, you know, so there's a little bit of like, oh.
Actually, I think a lot of the original appeal of the original Harry Potter was that it had the same good thing that you and I found in Enid Blyton as children, while also having magic, of course, but also a wider range of chosen children. They weren't all just rich white kids.
That's true.
They were people of other colours, and that was a positive thing that people found in them at the time, I think. Yeah. I really do think that was one of the things. I've also often thought that at the last Mallory Towers book, the end one, was published in 1967. So when those people went to university, it would have been just in time for swinging 60s. It would have been, there would have been dope, there would have been hippies, there would have been the Beatles. They completely missed it when they were in school, and they'd have come out and it would have been the 60s. That would have been very, very different for them.
Right. That's awesome.
But I also uncomplicatedly loved them as a child.
Yeah.
But when I sort of looked at them for reading them to Sasha, it was obvious that I wasn't going to. Because they're incredibly classist, if nothing else. And they're incidentally racist here and there, but mostly they're not racist because there's only white people.
That's right.
But whenever there isn't, they're racist. Yeah. But they are incredibly classist. They are incredibly awful about people who are lower class. Way worse than average for their time when they were written. So not really appropriate, but nevertheless a lot of fun when I was a kid, and probably absorbing all of these attitudes unconsciously.
This is what happens, right? So I think the newer editions I've seen have had the original text, but with framing notes for children.
Good idea.
And I think that's a good approach for it.
Very, very, very good idea. Yes.
So.
Yes.
All right. Well, I could talk to you forever, but I'm going to let you go. We'll wrap this up. I'm looking forward to reading the 2020 book, and I assume you're working on something else now, because you're always working on something, as far as I can tell.
Not in 2020, I wasn't. Well, actually, I was. I wrote a play called Heart's Home, which has been broadcast as a podcast by Odyssey Theatre in Ottawa, who had done a series of plays based on folklore and fairy tales.
Well, and even during the pandemic, you did that series of stories.
Yeah, the Decameron Project.
The Decameron Project, which you were kind enough to take one of mine for it, and I really enjoyed being part of that.
I love that story you wrote for it. It was great. That was the best thing about that. It has cured me of any desire to be an editor. Boy. But, I have a essay collection that'll be coming out in spring of 2024
with Ada, right?
with Ada.
That's great.
And also, Ada and I are writing a novel together.
Really?
Yeah, where she's done all the hard work of world building, and I'm writing most of the actual words.
Oh, that's going to be a delight.
A science fiction novel. And we're working on it now, but it'll be a while before it's done, obviously, because we're writing it now. And I am also starting to feel like writing things on my own, which I haven't felt like for a long time, because I was also depressed in the pandemic and kind of more than depressed. I think a lot of us had brain weasels of various kinds in the pandemic, and I certainly did.
Yeah.
And I need a certain amount of socialization to actually be a human being.
Me too. And we're not... there's this whole thing about when you go through a trauma, you don't start processing it till the trauma is over. And it's sort of over now, which means we're just at the start of processing it, so it's going to be a little while.
When I look at the last year and a half, I can see myself thinking, oh, I'm fine now. Oh, no, I wasn't fine then, but I'm fine now. Oh, no, I wasn't fine then, but actually I'm fine now. And I'm on this graph that is definitely an upward curve.
Yes.
But I feel like I actually am fine now.
There's a real urge to say, like, oh, yeah, now we're back to normal. And
that's right. Let's draw a line under that. Now I'm okay.
But I can tell I don't have the social energy that I did pre-pandemic. So, like, instead of doing 4 events in a week, I can do 1, and then I'm done. I need to, recuperate a little bit. So,
well, I want to see what I'm like when I go home, because traveling, I've been absolutely fine. I've been great. I've been writing. I've got energy. It's all been good. But when I go home, I don't want to get into the psychic down spiral of feeling trapped in my apartment that I did last winter. But also last winter we had a lockdown in Canada.
Yeah, that's very tough. One thing I did this year is I tried to schedule some trip away every month, and just try to be cautious and do it responsibly, but that was so helpful.
I've been away for a long time, and when I go home, maybe I'll be glad to be home.
Maybe you'll be glad to be
and if not, maybe I'll find another way of living that doesn't involve me being home all the time.
Yeah.
My normal life involves a fair amount of travel. Maybe it could involve even more travel.
That's right.
And spending time in other places, and that would be okay.
Yeah.
That would be okay.
We do have a guest suite in Chicago for the next 6 years or so, until my son's done with high school, and we're probably going to move out of this lovely big Victorian. So, you've got a window for Chicago visits, so you can split your time between me and Ada. So, anyway, thank you so much, Jo. This was great. I really appreciate it. Hey humans, don't forget to follow, like, and subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and more, so that you don't miss future episodes of Mohenraj and Rosenbaum Are Humans. Leaving us a good rating also helps us reach a wider audience. Engage with us on Twitter at MRAH Podcast, and check out our weekly clips of episodes. If you want to reach us directly to ask questions or continue the conversation, you can email us at mrahpodcast@specklet.org.
This podcast is hosted by Marianne Mohenraj and Benjamin Rosenbaum. Editing and show notes by Darius Vinisar. Music composed by Thor Bremer. And cover art by Stephanie Bailey. Thanks for tuning in to Mohenraj and Rosenbaum Are Humans.